We are live. Okay, so this is episode 1 of Pious Reflections. If you care about religion and culture, we are currently only live streaming on YouTube at the moment. We will expand to other networks or whatever you want to call it. Platforms is the word. Today, we are going to be talking about the unspoken grief of never becoming a grandparent, an article in the New York Times. And we are going to be talking about Calvin Robinson, an article that he wrote from 2023 on ecumenism and Protestants and Catholics that I think actually is very relevant to today, and that definitely should be true because I started reading it and I thought it was posted recently, and then I realized it was from 2023. But either way, we're going to be talking about that, so I hope that you enjoy this episode 1 of Pious Reflections. All right, welcome back. So before we get started, I do want to go over just some funny tweets to give you guys an idea of the kind of person I am because, we have millions of dollars here that we've invested into this project. And so I just know that many of you probably have very high expectations. But today I was very excited about this. I had some pretty good tweets today, and I just want to share them before we get started into the heavy stuff about church doctrine, whether or not your church can tell you can have kids and all that fun stuff, and critiquing one of my favorite Anglican priests. It's never fun when, you decide to go after one of those guys that you really enjoy, but hopefully it ends up getting me an interview with Father Calvin Robinson. I mean, that would be really cool. So, share this out and let him know that I criticized one of his articles from 2023 so I can talk to him. But today I had some tweets, and for those that don't know, I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit if I can. Let's see here. So there is a debate going on around on Twitter right now about the C.S. Lewis scholar, which which just is kind of funny to me anyway, because when you think about C.S. Lewis, you think about Narnia, but I guess you could definitely have like a C.S. Lewis scholar. I mean, he was influential and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, but there was a girl, not Bethel here. She's a friend of mine, actually. But there was a debate going on somewhere, and this girl who claims to be a C.S. Lewis scholar, again, not Bethel, but who actually is, scholarly in what she does. This other girl, though, apparently was like going after somebody else about how she had a PhD. She was a C.S. Lewis scholar, and that she wanted people to listen to her. And so I just got a kick out of this, and a bunch of people were laughing at it on Twitter, the 3 bots that I have. And this was what it was said. Since there was little discourse about C.S. Lewis scholarship yesterday, I reiterate that the entire concept of C.S. Lewis scholarship is silly and enables inflated self-image in people who are just really big C.S. Lewis fans. This is a gender-blind assessment, by the way. BTW, by the way. And I responded to my friend who was, again, it's not Bethel who's the snobby C.S. Lewis scholar, quote unquote, but she is critiquing it, and I decided to jump in the fun. PhD in Narnia here, which I do have. That is a real thing. And I have studied the hairs on the lion, and Lucy's, water is definitely something that scientists should look into. But yes.
Do you know how deep Aslan's claws have to dig into dragon scales in order to pull them
It's in the postdoctoral work.
Oh, okay.
But C.S. Lewis scholars are the undergrad of Lewis scholarship. I don't even talk to them until they can give me a paper on the intersection of quantum mechanics and the deep magic. People just need to level up these days before they jump into the Lewis PvP arena. And I just got a kick out of that. I was laughing as I was walking around the house today, and my kids got in trouble, and I was laughing, and it was good. And then there was one more. Megan Basham, who's done great reporting for the Daily Wire, talked about, at the doctor, 20-something looking nurse just called me a young lady in that patronizing tone medical workers sometimes use to be sweet to someone they clearly do not see as young, and I am devastated. And what I said was pretty funny, if I do say so myself. If one of the signs that you're a comic or a comedic person in my mind is that you can laugh at your own jokes. As my dad used to say, I'm the funniest guy I know. And that is definitely true of myself. And I said, the struggle is real. Last time I was at the doctor, they told me the same thing. I was like, how many ladies do you know with a beard? Then they showed me this emoji. And yes, there is a bearded woman emoji in our phones because we are insane. And then I started the back in my day speech. And I thought that those were all worthy of virality. And they didn't go viral. But maybe they will after you guys watch this stream. But on to more important issues. There was an article in the New York Times titled, and I'm going to grab it here, The Unspoken Grief of Never Becoming a Grandparent. And this ties into what we're going to talk about today, which is the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism, and the difference between the institution and the individual, and why these things are really important when we're talking about moral issues. And I felt like this was relevant because not just this article on grandparents not having grandkids, but also the idea of what does it mean for Christians to actually be united. And I felt like having written an article earlier this week on unity, or last week on unity, you can check it out at piousreflections.com, and John Paul II, unity and John Paul II is what the article is on. When Father Calvin Robinson's article on Protestantism and Catholicism popped up in my Substack feed, I thought, oh man, this is kind of a different approach, and this would be good to kind of engage my viewers and my readers on. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to start with this article from the New York Times and kind of use it as a segue into why you cannot be in a proper Christian without an institution. And so we're going to dive into that. So here is the article. Oh, that's Father Calvin Robinson stuff. So this is the title, Unspoken Grief of Never Becoming a Grandparent. A growing number of Americans are choosing not to have children. Their parents are grappling with what that means for them. This is by Catherine Pearson, November 11th. So I think that's today, isn't it? No, it's yesterday. So it reads, Lydia Burke, 56, has held on to her favorite copy of The Velveteen Rabbit since her 3 children, now in their 20s and 30s, were young. She loved being a stay-at-home mother and filled her family's home with books. All of her children could read before they started school, Miss Burke recalled with pride. She hoped one day to be a cool grandma who would share her favorite stories with a new generation. But none of her children wanted to have kids, and though that decision is right for them, Miss Burke said, it still breaks her heart. I don't have young children anymore, and now I'm not going to have grandchildren, she said, so that part of my life is just over. And before we dive into that, little bit of a reality check here. I mean, this is really an actual problem in the world. Our kids and my wife were at Meijer once, and so Lindsay, you can jump in here. That's the voice on the back of the stream. She doesn't like to be on the camera, and I don't like to let her out in public. But this one time
do you want me to tell you the story of what happened?
Well, no, I can start it, and then you can jump in if you want. But what ended up happening was that she told me this story, and you'll jump in a second. But basically, you were with kids, with our kids at Meijer, and this lady came up to you, and she basically said, "Can I buy your kids some snacks or treats in the aisle?" Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tell it now? It's called a setup. This is episode 1. We're lucky that there's nobody watching right now. We're figuring it out. You're still the only one in there. But anyway, keep going.
So we were checking out, and this sweet little old lady walked up and asked if she could give the kids some money to buy some gum, and I said yes, that was fine, and thank you so much. And then this poor little old lady told me that the reason that she was giving us this money was because she had no great grandchildren to do nice things for. I think she said she had maybe 6 or 8 grandchildren, and they had all determined that they would not be having children of their own. And she was so heartbroken that her days of loving on family members were over, that when she saw our kids, she just felt like she had to do something and wanted to encourage us. And
so she bought you guys some snacks.
Yeah, she bought treats. The kids some gum.
Yeah.
Yep.
And just for the record, our kids get this all the time. And I think it's this idea of older people just giving them stuff. And it is a bizarre thing. Like, I don't think we have had to buy bags of candy since we've had kids that could, talk to adults and stuff. And because when older people meet our kids, they just bring bags of candy like once a month, like a subscription service. And this is weird because it shows that they don't actually have these young people. So what the New York Times is talking about here in this article is indicative of something that's actually a bigger deal than just like a couple statistics and stuff. We are actually facing a real problem, and it's relevant to the Christian culture because there is an institution out there that kind of foreshadowed this, if you want to use that word, or prophetically predicted this with its teaching. And that was the Catholics, and we're gonna dive into that in a little bit. But we keep going down this rabbit hole here. Like Mrs. Burke, a growing number of Gen Xers and baby boomers are facing the same, sometimes painful fact that they are never going to become grandparents. A little more than half of adults 50 and older had at least one grandchild in 2021, down from nearly 60% in 2014. Amid falling birth rates, more U.S. adults say they're unlikely to ever have children for a variety of reasons. Chief among them, they don't want to. And the article goes on and talks about stuff. And I'll be honest, I didn't read the entire article because I didn't need to for tonight's stream. But the question becomes that last line there, and even Miss Burke, when she says, they're just making a decision that's right for them. This begs the question, number one, are they? Are they actually making the decision that's right for them? If they're not, who's supposed to tell them that the decision is immoral, not just a bad preference like, smoking tobacco or something like that? And who, if anybody, has actually predicted this, that, the idea that if you get married, you ought, moral obligation ought to have children. And I don't think any of us would be comfortable, and I know the people on the people on the left would not be comfortable with the government suddenly saying you are now legally required to have children. Like, I think everybody would say that's wrong, but we have no problem with people saying, you're legally required to, not murder people. Like, we like it when the government comes in and says, hey, don't do that. That's against the law. We have a real problem with conscription. Like, we don't like that. And, nobody would want like a baby draft where, suddenly they're going and grabbing women and saying like, all right, well, the birth rate's down and we need your womb. Or we need your eggs and we're going to make these babies in vitro or in a lab, baby maker 3000 or whatever. But this brings me to Father Calvin Robinson's article, where he talks about the idea of unity amongst Protestants and Catholics, and how we need to kind of get over things in our current kind of theological battle, because we're so fixated on fighting each other that we're forgetting about the greater cultural battle and evangelizing the world. And one of the things as we go through this that I want you to kind of pay attention to, and we're going to go through a couple slides. I don't want to cover the whole thing. I'll probably skip around a little bit. But one of the things that I want to bring up here in this article, I have it here up on the screen. It's titled Catholics versus Protestants, the Necessity for Church Unity. And I've been thinking a lot about this because, number one, I'm a convert to Catholicism. And so, and I've only been in the church for a year, but this is a question that I get a lot from my Catholic friend, from my Protestant friends, and from my Catholic friends. Basically the question like, so how are you to relate to us, is usually like the Protestant question. And then the Catholics are like, so how are your Protestant friends taking that you're Catholic? And, do you think they'll ever become Catholic? And there's this kind of tension that you're kind of stuck in no matter what, because you never thought you were going to be Catholic and now you are. And we're in a different time now. And in a sense, this time actually shows, at least from my perspective, that we are a lot more united individually about our faith in Jesus Christ, even though our institutions are wildly far apart. So we're just going to go through this article where he kind of jumps into this the nature of his his kind of reason for writing it. He basically says, he's been getting all these messages from different Protestants and different Catholics, and he says, he's basically getting it from two camps that are the most prominent in his inboxes at the moment are the Roman Catholics and the Protestants. And he starts off the article saying, increasingly, I'm receiving messages from my brothers and sisters in Christ, which appear to be an attempt at dividing the kingdom. The number of sectarian comments and direct messages is concerning, but then I suppose we're tribal by nature. And so this is basically to kind of set up the reason why he's writing this. It's not like he just jumped into this and decided that he wanted to ruffle some feathers or anything like that. He's actually responding to the experience that he's having. And again, Father Calvin Robinson, if you see this and you want to talk about this article, I would love to have that conversation, because I think I could learn some things or a thing or two from you about Anglicanism. And, I don't know that you could learn anything from me, but it would be a great conversation. But I do think that Father Calvin is wrong in this article, and I think that it's okay to disagree with people that you admire and appreciate. Also, he's in Michigan now, which is where I used to be, and hopefully maybe I'll bump into him at some point and say, hey, I critiqued one of your articles on my stream. Maybe I won't lead with that, but as we go into this article, we're going to just start off and we're going to go through some of these highlights that he has. He says, schism is not good. Separation is not to be desired, and we should pray and work toward a united church. The Council of Vatican II reported that Catholics today should not hold Protestants of today to blame for the sin involved in the separation, and I think that works both ways. We should focus on the things that unite us, such as our faith in Christ, over the things that divide us, such as our worship styles. Now, I agree with everything that he said right there, right up until he says worship styles. The thing behind any worship is your theological positions. And behind any theological position is not the individual, it is the institution. And so, while I agree that he is right about the unity that we should be concerned with, the way that we get there can't be merely this nominal Christianity where everybody who says, I believe, Lord, Lord, is now a Christian or somebody we can unite with, which I don't think he would agree with, but it certainly seems like that's what he's implying throughout this article, is that there's this emphasis on individuals can unite with each other, because ultimately, and it's ironic that he would actually criticize the synod on synodality, because that seems to be what that whole thing, at least from the outside looking, was about, was that, well, we need these individuals to come together and kind of tell us what's going on the ground so that the church knows what's going on. And Calvin Robinson seems to be kind of approaching it from the same approach here, that we need these individuals, like the individuals are the body of Christ, not any one institution. And I want to just emphasize this as we go through this article. As we're going through, understand that there is a difference between the institution and the individual. And that has to be paramount, that there is no such thing as a Christian by himself. He is a part of some religious community, and the people who think that they can just be Christian because it's just them and Jesus will never be able to fully imitate Christ, because they're not submitting to anybody but themselves. So in order for us to imitate Christ and to be fully aligned with Christ, we have to have institutions that we are submitting to. And there has to be one, logically speaking. Now, again, I haven't said that I think that's the Catholic Church, but it just follows that if Church A says that Church B is false on a doctrine, well, then we should investigate Church A and see if Church A actually is true across the board. And otherwise, none of these institutions are actually the church that Christ founded, and therefore we can't even find the church. It's just inside of us, but we know that can't be the case because we don't agree at all with what's inside our neighbor as far as doctrine versus what's inside of me as far as doctrine, meaning our beliefs. And so just keep that in mind. Like, individuals don't get to determine the worship style of a said thing. So moving on, as we keep going, he says, it is also worth mentioning, I will not even entertain the tired revisionist argument that the church split entirely because King Henry VIII wanted to remarry. That dismisses the call for reformation from the continent, ignores the Catholicity of Henry VIII, and forgets we are still a Catholic nation until Elizabeth I was excommunicated by Pope Pious V. And then he keeps going, and the Catholic Church submit to a king or a foreign pope. They didn't instantly become Anglicans in the sense that we use that word today. And I think this is very helpful. This is why I do think people should read this article, because I think it's going to help educate people on the complexity of what it means to be Protestant today versus what it means to be in the Reformation. I bet you a lot of Protestants don't know that, the Catholic Church doesn't look at you like Martin Luther. Like you didn't start the schism. You inherited a schism. You didn't, propagate the heresies. You inherited heresies that you think are true, and the church recognizes that. And so they don't hold you to the same standard as they would, say, somebody who goes in and divides the church and rejects everything that they teach, which I was surprised to find out about. So when it comes to these positions, and I'm going to pull up that slide real quick one more time so I can see it. Oh yeah, that was what I was going to say. So the other thing about this is that most people think that, when I was Anglican, a lot of I myself and others, I think, thought that the Anglicans were just kind of part of the Protestants, but they aren't. They actually are extremely Catholic, and they're just probably, at the time when they were in schism with King Henry VIII, it would be more that they were in schism than it was that they were in heresy, because the fact that, the Pope wouldn't grant King Henry VIII the annulment that he wanted. So he's not even trying to get a divorce; he's trying to get an annulment. So there's a level at which they're not arguing over, sola scriptura, for example. They're arguing over the authority and doing what King Henry wants. Now, you can take or leave whatever Father Calvin Robinson says there. I'm not an Anglican scholar, so I'm not going to try and pretend that I know exactly what happened with King Henry VIII, but there is a movie that everybody recommends called The Man for All Seasons, and maybe that's pretty accurate. But I bet you Father Calvin probably doesn't agree. Moving on, where institutions drive us apart, and I want to stop right there. Institutions do not drive us apart. Institutions are, by definition, the establishment of different truth claims, and then people unite in those institutions. So we are the United States of America. That means we're not Britain. So the same thing is true of our religious institutions. A Baptist is just not a Catholic, but that doesn't mean that the Baptist is, by virtue of identifying as a Baptist, is suddenly, fomenting this division across all of Christendom, and that's why he's a Baptist. He's a Baptist because he thinks it's true. Or he's an Anglican because he thinks it's true. Or he's a Catholic because he thinks it's true. The truth is divisive, and the truth claims that we make form assemblies, and those are the institutions. And so you're never going to get away from hierarchy. He says, Christ brings us together. That is true, and we'll talk more about the Eucharist in a minute. Roman Catholics who claim to be the only ones to be saved sound more like Calvinists they purport to oppose. This is totally true, by the way. You will definitely see when you become Catholic that the people who are converts from the Reformed tradition tend to bring in some of that heavy predestination stuff and even some of that Reformed epistemology into the church. And then the people who weren't part of that tradition tend to kind of gravitate towards a more predestination light. Are you trying to get my attention there? No, you're good. Okay. He goes on. There is charity in the common statement, come home. For those that don't know, that's what Roman Catholics say to Protestants, come home to Rome, because we as Catholics do view Protestants as Christians as long as they're baptized. That is for sure. But there is also an incredible lack of humility in the assumption that they all have the answers and have no need for reformation. The Holy Spirit does indeed work through the church, but the church is also an attractive target for the devil. We must not forget that. No institution made up of sinners can ever be perfect. Correct. The problem with this is, what about Calvin Robinson and his view that needs to be reformed? And reformed towards what? Because this is ultimately a self-defeating statement. He is presenting himself as if he, the individual, actually has the bird's eye view of all of these institutions who have way more history than he does in years on earth. And he is going to now stand as the arbiter of what all of these churches should do, which is ironic because he doesn't agree with papal infallibility. So he's implying his own infallible nature here. Now, I guarantee you, if he came on the podcast, he would probably say, no, that's not what I mean. I'm not really believing that. And again, I'm not meaning to pick on Calvin Robinson. He's just one who wrote the article. But I think that a lot of people do think this today. I've had friends say, it's time for us to let the walls come down. It's like, well, no, those walls are there to keep out bad teaching. That is the point. And when we say bad teaching, it's not necessarily that it keeps out bad teachers. Because again, there's a difference between the individual who spouts heresy and stuff and is not disciplined within the church versus a church that says, yeah, abortion is a necessary evil, a la the Methodists. So I agree with the fact, I agree with his intent to try and call people to unity. But that unity that he is striving for, I think already exists there. The Twitterverse is not the real thing. Like when I get together with my family and stuff, we're still getting together and we're still talking about politics. We're still talking about all these things. And, we definitely do not agree theologically on virtually anything because now I'm Catholic. Now they might agree on some things, but their institutions definitely don't. So the reality is that individuals can unite around something, but it won't be doctrinal. It's going to be around some shared natural law principle. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And again, as we continue to look at this in the light of the fact that we have these young people who are not having kids, you have to have a religious institution that can say, this is what God wants you to do with your body and your life. Because a religious institution is not something that you have to submit to. It's something you choose to submit to. And so just like Christ says, well, come and follow me, you don't have to follow him. You can go do what you want. There's consequences to that. But what we're seeing is there are now consequences to not following the church's teaching. And like we see in this article of, the unspoken grief of never becoming a grandparent, we're finding out that, yeah, actually the church was right on this point. And they were right on virtually every moral point, actually, that has plagued the United States for the last 50 years. He goes on, then there are the Protestants who seem to think Catholics are not even Christians. And this is also true. But again, this is dropping significantly. So, when he wrote this, I'm not sure that he actually thought, I'm not sure how much he was writing from a place of personal experience versus the actual data. But I still think that this is good because I think a lot of Protestants actually do think this, that Catholics aren't saved, that they're and again, that even that is to imply a Protestant view of salvation, which no one agrees on in the Protestant church. So when we come into this to this article and we look at this, he says, there are the Protestants who seem to think Catholics are not even Christians, the Protestants who constantly misinterpret Catholic doctrine, Protestants who think they understand the Bible better than their Catholic brethren. The assumption is that they're the only ones to have ever read and or understood the Bible properly. These are the Protestants to whom church history began 500 years ago rather than 2,000 years ago. The problem here is they spend so much time being anti-Catholic, they are no longer reforming, they are corroding. And again, this comes back to this idea, though, that these institutions do not... The whole assumption is that basically institutions need to get on board with what Calvin Robinson calls Christianity. Which, again, I don't think that he would necessarily want, but that is the implied assumption here, is that he is this kind of, middle way Anglo-Catholic. And if everybody just kind of got on board with what he thinks, then, we would all be okay. Hey, Baptist, I know you like that, that symbolic, liturgy that, there's nothing going on here, but, that shouldn't keep you from, fellowshipping with a Catholic. And most Protestants today, I think, and Catholics would say, yeah, it doesn't. When you get out in the real world and you start talking to these people, I do think that most of them would say, yeah, I don't have a problem with my friend who's a Catholic. He's kind of a nice guy. I mean, at this point, Christians are having to get very comfortable with just LGBT people in their life that they didn't have before. I mean, how many Christians who disagree with LGBT actually listen to Andrew Klavan on a regular basis, whose son, Spencer Klavan, is an open homosexual? So, I mean, obviously we're all having to get along to some degree. But he keeps going. The physical repulsion to any beauty in worship shows the vacuous nature. He's talking about the fact that Protestants tend to not have as beautiful of a liturgy. which is true. The vacuous nature of Puritanism that has seeped into Protestantism over time. Beauty is transcendental. It takes us out of ourselves and redirects our gaze toward God. That is what good art should do, as well as holy music, ritualistic worship, solid liturgy, should help us empty ourselves of our inner desires and facilitate our prayer to be filled with God's will. How can any Christian be against beautiful worship? But again, this is going to make more enemies, I think, than it is going to bring unity. Because what he's ultimately saying is that we should have indifference. For example, I was talking to a canon lawyer who told me that the Orthodox do not permit their members to even attend a Protestant service, whereas a Catholic, for reasons of ecumenism or whatever, could attend a Protestant service, but they can't take communion under otherwise it'd be a mortal sin. So is Calvin Robinson saying that, I should just set those teachings aside if I'm an Orthodox, that I should just come together and worship? How is a Baptist supposed to look at what the Orthodox and the Catholics have around the Mass and incorporate it into their liturgical traditions, which is basically nothing, and remain Baptist? So this appeal, again, it's not so much Calvin Robinson. I'm kind of picking on him, but this is something that seems to be ubiquitous around. Like, I don't think Father Calvin Robinson's view is the minority view amongst Christians today. I think a lot of Christians are afraid of the kind of oppression of the state. They're seeing things like in England where they're arresting people for praying silently. They're starting to feel this pressure, and they're starting to say, which I think is wrong, you know what? Our churches aren't actually important. What's really important is that we just stick together. And that's not a good approach, because all nations rise and fall, and it's only the church that Christ promised would remain. And so I think you got to be careful when you start to say, like, well, how can a Christian be against beautiful worship? Well, the reason why a Baptist, just speaking as one who used to be one, the reason why a Baptist would be against quote unquote beautiful worship is because their theology says it's idolatry. So we can't sit here and suddenly say, like, kind of throw rocks at them for not having the same beautiful worship when they're like, well, we just believe in symbols. We don't believe that you should have any artwork. We don't believe in any of those things because we don't want any images of Christ or whatever. And so that's a big problem. And as we wrap up, I think this will become clear. He says there are bigger, more urgent battles to be fought. There are those who would drag the church into apostasy with heretical views on the issues of human sexuality, denigrating the sacrament of holy matrimony. Same-sex marriage is not an issue exclusive to Anglicans. It is also a threat in Roman Catholicism, thanks to the German bishops and the Synod on synodality. And he goes on to say some more stuff here. Let me just jump ahead here. The argument about which corner of the church contains the most errors is a fatal one. Any institution made up of fallen individuals will have problems. The 20th century has not been kind to either camp. Contraception, women's ordination, trans rebaptism, and now same-sex blessings have been tearing apart the Anglican communion, whilst the liberal progressive spirit of Vatican II, the child abuse scandal, and now the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass have been ripping Rome apart. And I understand where he's coming from on some of this stuff, but again, the question is, it comes back to, well, what role does an institution have in uniting us? Because right now, you've taken pot shots at every institution and also implied that Protestants are united. And in this section that we've been talking about right here, the reality is that a lot of these, previous moral failings that he kind of talks about here, the issues of human sexuality, denigrating the sacrament of holy matrimony, I'm assuming he's talking about divorce, same-sex marriage, is not exclusive, all these different things, like the Protestants do not have a shared moral teaching on any of those issues. And let alone the idea that the church could tell you should not use contraception, or that you should not, that if you get married, you're obligated morally by God to have children. Now, if you look at what's going on in our culture right now, this is a problem. And like I said before, who's going to tell the grandma's children You are morally obligated to have kids. We don't think it can be the state. We definitely don't think it can be the grandma. The only person who has that authority is God. But where is that person going to get that information? Well, be fruitful and multiply. Well, yeah, be fruitful and multiply, but you could evangelize. You could do a lot of things. And the amount of, and I grew up in a place where people mocked this teaching in the church, and I used to think it was stupid too. And then I started seeing Elon Musk start telling everybody to have kids. Started seeing Jordan Peterson starting to come out and talk about how radical the contraception was to society and how it really radically changed our perception of what a woman is. So we are seeing right now the consequences of people, not Protestants, but just people rejecting the teachings of the church. And so I think we have to look at something like this when we say, well, we can all be united. There's bigger fish to fry, basically, than our theological differences. But when this earth has passed away, the theological truth is what's going to remain. And so we want to be as close to Christ as we can be on this earth. And so he continues to go on here. He says, contraception, women's ordination, Anglicanism. Virtually every single denomination right now, with the exception of, you got the Methodists, you got the Presbyterians, some groups. All of these have split over these issues. The Methodists are basically saying that abortion is okay. You've got same-sex ordination, or you got LGBT ordination in the Church of England. That was a big reason why the Anglicans became what they were. And then you've got Anglicans like Father Calvin Robinson, who's old right. So, yeah, this is ripping it apart. But the problem is that you don't have any of these positions actually united on. And so there's one last slide here. He says, as Christianity declines in the West, the battle is no longer between Roman Catholic and Protestant denominations, or even amongst us Anglicans between Anglo-Catholics and evangelicals. The battle is now increasingly between Orthodox and heterodox, between conservatives and liberals. We must band together, Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox, Evangelical, Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal, to protect the faith against liberal progressive secularization. To that, we must live out our faiths fully and in unity. So, last couple things. Number one, Anglicans believe in female ordination. So do certain Pentecostal groups and Methodists. So that was one of the issues he cited. So how are we going to unite if the institutions are telling people that these things are the teachings of their institutions? Furthermore, you have Catholics and Orthodox and old Anglicans who would say that the Eucharist is really important. But the Evangelical, the Baptist, the Methodist, and the Pentecostal would say that's idolatry. Now, maybe some Methodists might say, well, it's still a sacrament. So I'll give a pass on that. But what you're ultimately calling for is us to leave, and this is what this means, to bring the walls down, is to leave what we believe Christ instituted. Because again, Baptist or Methodist or Pentecostal or whatever, presumably believe that their church is the church that Jesus wants everybody in. Now, if you don't believe that, then the question is, well, is there a church that God wants everybody to be in? And if your answer is no, well then, I guess we can't really know. But this comes back to this question of unity and faiths and the idea that nobody owns Christ. Well, but the idea that Christ unites us is definitely true in the sense that we all want to serve him. But Christ, before he died, said he wanted us to be one, as he and the Father are one. And I have a hard time believing that doctrine doesn't play any role in that, considering the amount of writing that St. Paul and St. Peter wrote on the importance of doctrine and not twisting the scriptures to allow us to do whatever we wanted. And so there's one last thing that I'm going to say on this, and that is on the Eucharist. The Eucharist, Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity in a consecrated bread and wine, is what the early church believed you should look for when you were looking for the church. We think that like the church would just be easy to find, when you're back in, I'll just look it up on Google Maps, or I'll just go down, Jerusalem Highway 101 and I'll look for a church on the nearest exit ramp. But think about the idea that you hear about this man healing. He's dead. He rises from the dead. He goes away. You hear about his followers. And then you also find out that there's these other groups that are kind of like acting like the Christians, and you don't really know which one's which. Well, how are you going to find the one that you're supposed to be at? And Augustine says that the Eucharist is, the unifying thing. That's the sign of unity amongst the Christians. And the Catholic Church teaches that this is the summit of our faith, the source and summit of our faith. We receive nourishment from the Eucharist, and it is what we ultimately are striving for in heaven at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And this is really important, because if that's not really Christ on the altar, then Father Calvin is correct that it doesn't really matter what denomination we're in. But if it actually is Christ on the altar, then you should want to be there. You should want to find out if it really is Christ on the altar, because if that's really Christ, then that means that you can be united to him in a way that is not even possible in any of the other denominations, because they literally teach that it's false. But they could be wrong, as Father Calvin Robinson points out when he's criticizing Catholics who think they're right. And as we criticize him for thinking that he's right. And so we can go around this all the time. But unless there's an institution that says, yeah, this is what's the normative way for Christianity, then there is no normative way, and we can't criticize each other. We can't actually have something like orthodoxy and heterodoxy, because everybody is just a priest unto himself. So, in closing, Thomas Aquinas said that it's not the body that contains the soul, it is the soul that contains the body. Meaning the soul is the delimiter. It is what sets the boundaries of what is the body. It is the form of the body. And it is the acting principle, the principle of movement by which the soul animates the body. It is the animating principle. And I thought about this because you can take a lot of what Thomas Aquinas says about human beings and the soul and the anthropology, and you can apply it to the church. Christ's soul is the limiting principle of the church. The body, blood, soul, and divinity is the acting principle of the church. It is not the body of Christ that contains the Eucharist. It's the Eucharist that contains the church. It is the limiting principle of where the church starts and where it ends. And so what do we do about these Protestants that are baptized and stuff? Well, what about them? Well, they're outside of the church walls. They are in the courtyard, so to speak. But God is still calling them to the summit of their faith. And when this nation has fallen and another nation takes its place and the world looks different, the church will still remain. If it doesn't, then Christianity was false. So at the end of the day, well, I love Father Calvin Robinson. I think he's great. He's great on so many issues. We agree on so much as far as the culture. This particular issue around Catholics versus Protestants is one that I think is, in ecumenism, is really something we need to get right. We have to understand that, if you're a Baptist, you need to be the best Baptist you can be, because I think that's going to lead you to become a Catholic. Or if you're a Pentecostal, you should be the best Pentecostal you can be, because what that means is that you're actually searching for the truth. And that's what ultimately leads somebody, I think, into the Catholic Church, is when they start to realize, well, wait a second, if I'm looking into what my church teaches on this, this, and this, you start to realize, well, why did we have that debate in the first place? Well, it's because the Catholics said that's usually where it comes from. It's not because, some theologian came up with this great idea. It's, well, we're trying to distance ourselves from that Catholic teaching, and so we know that that's false, so we should try and figure out what we're going to replace it with. But that is ultimately what you start to realize, well, I'm going to pull on this thread. I'm going to go back and see where this leads. And that's what leads to unity. Individuals can be united, but institutions can't. Because institutions, by definition, are trying to exclude themselves from the other ones or make themselves set apart from the other institutions. And so in order for us to continue to have unity, we do, as Father Calvin Robinson says, find those things that are shared. But it can't be at the expense of our faith traditions. We have to recognize that, yeah, part of the way that people find the gospel is by the fact that people are willing to say, no, this is the truth. And that wrestling over the truth is what ultimately brings out this beautiful, bright, and one holy Catholic and apostolic church. So this is episode 1. We'll be back tomorrow. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.